The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we will be speaking with Ambassador Marc Grossman. Ambassador Grossman served as United States Ambassador to Turkey, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and Undersecretary for Political Affairs. He is currently a Vice Chairman of the Cohen Group. He is a writer and has made many contributions to advance American diplomacy. Ambassador Grossman, welcome to the show from Washington.
I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Ambassador Grossman, it is truly an honor for us to speak to you today. I'd like to turn to a recent chapter that you had come out in a book on diplomacy and ask you in general, what is the purpose of American diplomacy and what are the challenges that the United States faces today?
Michael, thank you very much. And of course, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to that volume on diplomacy. It was my honor to do so. So I think that the question of what's the purpose of American diplomacy is quite simple, actually. It's to protect and defend the interests of the United States of America. It's to promote the interests of the United States of America. And I think the people who come to work at the State Department in Washington, at our embassies abroad, all come to work with that objective in mind, and it's a really important thing, and I hope the American public will support that effort every day. The challenges we face now, as you both know better than anyone, are enormous. The world has changed rapidly over the last 10 or 15 years. We now face questions about great power competition. We face questions about technology. We face great questions about war. We face questions about economic diplomacy, technological diplomacy. And all of these things are requiring American diplomacy not just to be challenged, but also to evolve. And I think one of the greatest jobs of leaders of our diplomacy today is to help the institution evolve so that it can meet these new challenges. And I'd say the enormous, enormous opportunities that are out there for the United States to, again, promote its interests.
Excellent. I'm going to follow up on that and look at the three challenges that you point out in your chapter. Namely, one would be the unequal distribution of benefits from globalization that leads to nationalism, the rise of technologies that change how people relate to each other and how they relate to government, and the fraying of the world order, which for decades saw the United States as the major power. How do these changes affect American diplomacy today?
Well, they affect the American diplomacy every day in every way. I mean, if you are an ambassador of the United States of America in any country around the world, you know, part of your conversation, I'm sure, every week with the host government, with the host public, is kind of how to manage these three questions. And the issue for American diplomacy, as I was saying to Michael, is how does it evolve, right? And so when you look at that first challenge, I think globalization created an enormous amount of wealth around the world. Millions and millions of people came out of poverty. And that's something I think to be proud of. But the challenge is that globalization wasn't good for everybody. An enormous number of people, including people in the United States, got left behind. And so the issue is now how to deal with the economic structures that we have so that they continue to create growth, very important, but also create growth in such a way that more and more people benefit. And as I said in the chapter you were kind enough to receive from me, you know, you could be a great diplomat, but if you've got to be representing a country that's strong, and strength comes from economic strength, and from many other things as well, but from economic strength. And so the question is, how do you design an economic system that expands the benefits of growth? Secondly, on the question of technology, you know, since the chapter was written, you have this enormous new conversation about AI, right? And what will AI do? Well, I think there are going to be a lot of positives to artificial intelligence, and you can see the State Department is working hard, and our diplomacy and our diplomats working hard to kind of capture the benefits of AI. But as you know very well from your own profession, there are challenges with AI as well. And so harnessing this to be an advantage for diplomacy also extremely, extremely important. And then finally, on the question of world order, I guess it was probably easier in some ways when I had the good fortune to represent the United States abroad. But the world order, as you say, is not just fraying, it's changing. And countries are now have the opportunity to kind of go their own way. It's what the economists call, the T25, the transactional 25. People who don't have to and are not interested in choosing between the United States, China, the United States, Russia. They want to get their own benefits. And you think about countries like Turkey, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, major, major countries in the world that are making their own choices about their own national interests. And so American diplomacy is going to have to, if it continues to promote and protect and defend the United States of America, is going to have to figure out how to deal with these countries as they make their own decisions, so that the majority of their own decisions are beneficial, obviously, to the United States.
Fantastic. You served the United States at a time when the U.S. had to address several important policies, including strengthening NATO's conventional weapons capacity, the effort to save the Kurds, and 2 rounds of NATO expansion as well as the fight against terrorist financing. How is diplomacy essential to Washington's ability to achieve these goals?
Well, I think diplomacy is essential in all of these cases, Michael. If you look at the way these things came up and then turned out, diplomacy played a very important part in all of them. But I think the thread or the theme, if you would allow me, that runs through the examples you were kind enough to cite is the question of involving the whole of government. In other words, diplomacy doesn't stand on its own. For example, if you talked, as you just did, about stopping terrorist financing, well, you can't do that without the Treasury Department, and you can't do that without the Commerce Department. You can't do that without the law enforcement agencies or the intelligence agencies of the United States. And so I would say that as historians look back, I hope as they look back on this period, they'll find that those policies that were the most successful were the most whole of government, that involved kind of the largest pieces of our national security apparatus. And I think you can see that, as I say, in all the examples that you cited, and many others as well. If you're going to run a successful policy in today's world, it has to be a whole of government policy. And if you can do that, you vastly increase your chances of success.
Excellent. Ambassador Grossman, what is necessary for there to be a positive outcome for the Ukraine war? And how has the war affected the transatlantic partnership?
Well, Doug, I guess I would say, and I don't mean to argue with you or change the nature of your question, but it's hard to see anything positive at this stage out of the enormous destruction that Vladimir Putin and Russia has caused in Ukraine. I sometimes think we jump too quickly to the international relations theory about all this stuff, but when you think about the death and destruction and misery that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused, it's hard to see how it ends up positively. I think our objective ought to be to try to find an end to this war, first of all, that protects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine as much as that is possible. And secondly, from an American perspective, and I recognize there are many other perspectives, from an American perspective, that the war comes to an end with those who would in the future sort of be aggressors against their neighbors realize it doesn't pay. And I think that's a really important theme and an important objective as President Biden and Secretary Blinken and all the others in the United States government try to kind of manage this conflict. On the question of transatlantic relations, I think it's kind of been mixed, actually. First of all, there's been a tremendous increase in the importance given to transatlantic relations, certainly in Europe, and I hope in the United States as well. One of the great advantages that the United States has in this world is we have allies and we have friends. And you can see how that worked as President Biden mobilized them to respond to the invasion of Ukraine. Europeans and Americans have contributed a vast sum of money and a vast amount of military equipment to Ukraine. There's going to be a NATO summit here celebrating the 75th anniversary of NATO, 9th, 10th, 11th of July. And what's going to be a theme there? Transatlantic unity, transatlantic values, continued support for Ukraine. So in many ways, I think probably in a majority of ways, it's strengthened the transatlantic alliance. In some ways, though, it's also reminded us of how much more work there is to do and how much more closely there needs to be, defense industrial base work between Europe and the United States. And I hope some of that can be done transatlantically. How much it's important that we have a unified policy as much as possible toward China, for example, continuing a unified policy toward Russia. So what's been accomplished, I think, is very great. But part of the question for the transatlantic relationship now is what more needs to be done. And I think you'll see a lot of that in the outcome of the NATO summit early in July.
Fantastic. Ambassador Grossman, I'd like to turn to a comment that you made earlier talking about countries going their own way and not having to play a great power conflict game that you were talking about earlier. So I'd like to ask you, why has the West been unsuccessful in getting states in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to sanction Russia, for example, for the Ukraine war? And why has our message only been partly received in other parts of the world?
Well, I think, Michael, that's a hugely important question. And I think people in government, surely, and we as citizens ought to be thinking hard about that, about why, when they vote at the United Nations, it's so hard to get a condemnation, for example, of Russian actions in Ukraine. I think there are a couple of reasons. One is to go back to the conversation we were just having. I think the world order today, such as it is, has opened up the opportunity for countries to make different choices, right? And so, for example, if you are India, with whom the United States has a fantastic, huge, important relationship, but the Indians now buy an enormous amount of oil from Russia. And the question is, so will American diplomacy take it as an objective to go to New Delhi and say, you shouldn't buy that oil? Well, it's hard to know because you've got so many other questions. You think about Turkey, for example. Turkey's got a very important relationship with Russia. In fact, without that relationship, there'd be no grain, I believe, coming out of the Black Sea. On the other hand, they've been selling drones to Ukraine. They support Ukraine in so many ways. They're NATO members. So this has become, I think, more complicated because there are more opportunities. And secondly, if you'd allow me, this is just a personal opinion, I think one of the reasons that our message has been harder to convey these last few years is because we are inconsistent. And people abroad, they want to see the United States be consistent in its values. They want to see the United States be consistent in its policies. And for various reasons, I don't think we've been so consistent over the last few years. And I think it's one of the reasons that people say, well, thank you for your message, but, we're going to do what we want.
Ambassador Grossman, the United States now has to worry about a growing presence from China. China's prowess has expanded in international affairs. And how does American diplomacy work in allowing us to resist Beijing's expansion in critical areas such as 5G networks, advanced technology, rare earth material, and other areas of geopolitical competition?
Again, a wonderful question, Doug. Thank you. I would say, and again, you may not, you may think, well, you're a diplomat, so you should only think about what's going outside the United States. I happen to believe that one of the most important things that we can do to keep China in check is to be strong in the United States, right? I mean, really strong. And that means in terms of our domestic politics. But it also means being strong in our economic life. So, being as strong as we can possibly be in terms of our infrastructure, I think, and again, you may disagree with me, but I think the CHIPS Act is a really important piece of foreign policy because it says to people, we intend to protect our capacity or build our capacity and then protect our capacity to build things like microchips. And, it isn't right that 80% of the highest rated microchips are built outside the United States. So, so I think the first thing is to show the world, and especially to show the Chinese, that we are a strong and vibrant and growing nation. And that's the foundation, I think, of any policy toward China. The second part of our policy toward China has to be realistic about this, and I go back to the question that we were talking about on transatlantic relationships. Here again, the greatest advantage the United States of America has in the Pacific is that we have allies, and not just friends, but we have treaty allies. Japan, Thailand, Australia, Korea. These are countries with which we have treaty relationships. And if you see the evolution of our diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, what do you see? A revitalization of the Quad, the countries Japan, Australia, India, and the United States working together on extremely, extremely important issues. You see also the creation of AUKUS, this effort to strengthen the military relationship between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. You see it in the ways that we're cooperating with countries in Asia on many different things. So keeping our alliances strong is also a very, very important way to send the message to China that we are not going to be forced out of the Indo-Pacific, that we are here to stay, and we have allies who will help us stay. And then third, as I've said, diplomacy is really important. I have a bias, of course, for that. But it also has to be backed by military force. So continuing to expand our capacity in the Indo-Pacific is extremely important as well. So I think strength at home, our allies, and then being strong militarily in the Pacific will stand us in quite good stead over the years to come.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ambassador Grossman, in the past, the United States was clearly in favor of free trade agreements. However, you mentioned earlier the problems associated with globalization and the fact that some people have been left behind. What does the United States need to do to reframe our attitude toward globalization?
I don't know, Michael, if we can ever reframe our attitude toward globalization back to what it was. Because I think those days are over, at least for some time, because of the realization of how many people were left behind, because of the realization that this nationalism and has grown, not 100%, don't get me wrong, but some from the fact that people said, this globalization thing's working for somebody, but it ain't working for me. And that's true in America, and it's true in other places around the world. So I think the idea that, we just got to go back to the way it was, I don't think that's realistic. So the question is now, how do you create, again with our friends and our allies, how do you create a world economic system that promotes growth first and foremost, and then find some way to spread that growth in a way that's perhaps fairer than it was before. I don't say that fairness is the only objective here. Growth is the objective, right? But growth for its own sake, I think, isn't going to convince publics to continue to participate in this conversation. The other thing is, just to go back for a moment to the answer I gave to Doug about China, which is we have to be more confident in our own capacities in the United States, in our own economy. So that's why the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, is so important. Because if we can get a little more confident, I don't think we'll be so afraid of entering into these kinds of pacts. And then finally, again, I'm not a big expert, but I think those experts who are writing and talking about kind of returning to trade through regional connections first, I think there's probably something to that. So if you think about Canada, Mexico, the United States, what a huge economic driver that might be. or if we could find some way to get back into kind of a regional conversation in Asia, right, which would be beneficial to the United States, and the same perhaps over a transatlantic relationship. So I don't think it's going back to the way it was. I hope growth will continue to be a very important piece of all of this, and I'm attracted to those people who are saying, let's do these regional pacts and see what happens.
Excellent, excellent. Mr. Grossman, I'm going to change the focus a little bit and ask you to talk about the changes that are recommended in the blueprints for a more modern U.S. diplomatic service that was released back in September of 2022. What reforms can strengthen the State Department and enable it to better serve the American people? Well,
thank you for mentioning it. A number of us got together and tried to offer to the people who are serving today, because it's to honor them, some thoughts that we had, having served and been proud to serve, about what might be useful in the future. And there are quite a number of these recommendations, Doug, as you know. One is to strengthen the mission and the mandate of the State Department, to try to have the State Department earn, not be given by charity, but to earn its way back into the center of national security decision making. Secondly, there was a huge focus on professional education. One of the things that the State Department, I will say, has done a much better job of over the past few years, but there's still work to be done, is a focus on professional education. And if you look at what our military colleagues do, someone who, like me, was in 32 years in the military, have been to much, much more professional education than State Department people get. I don't say we have to reach that same level, but some more is required. And we also recommended that those people who are in professional education be there seriously. In other words, not be picked away to meet the latest crisis, that their focus for the time they're in education is to be in education. And then the other main element, and again, the State Department has been very receptive to this, and we appreciate it, is to create a diplomatic reserve corps. Again, our military forces all have reserves. You can see how fantastic they are and how useful they are in times of crisis. And we recommend the State Department do the same. Not huge, not large, 1,000 people created over 4 or 5 years, but we think that a reserve corps would be very helpful. Again, I have to say that if you look at the recommendations from 2022, a large number of them have been adopted by the department, and we're proud of that, and we thank them for that. And we continue to work closely with the State Department and friends on Capitol Hill to see if we can't now kind of finish the job, at least as we see it.
Fantastic. Ambassador Grossman, I'd like to turn to a novel that you published in 2020, and it was entitled Believers, Love and Death in Tehran with John Limbert. It's an impressive effort. What is the novel about for our viewers to know, and what did you wish to say with it?
Well, thank you very much. Well, we, first of all, Ambassador Limbert and I, John Limbert and I, we had a wonderful time writing this together. People were always asking us, was it hard? We were saying, are you kidding? It was a joyful effort. It was a lot of fun. It took us a couple of years. But we were very happy to have tried this. I would say, Michael, the first thing we were trying to do was we were trying to tell a good story. And the number of times I must say that we laughed at each other and said, that little phrase, you can't make this stuff up. Well, it turns out, actually, you can. It's called fiction. And so we had a wonderful time trying to create this. I think the story we were trying to tell was of a series of human beings in Tehran, in Washington, who were just pushed and pulled by various forces, some in their control, most not. And both of us had experiences which were like that. John Limbert, as you know, was a hostage for 444 days in Tehran. And so we wanted to try to convey kind of the value of diplomacy, but also how hard it is. And how hard people have to work to make it successful, and that it has these impacts on individual human beings, right? It's not just theory. There are there are individual impacts. And so, as I say, we had a lot of fun doing this. Whenever I have inscribed a book, I've said, I hope you have as much fun reading this as we had writing it. And we wanted to try, and we did it.
Excellent. Ambassador Grossman, you have some very interesting life experience as a diplomat. What were your most rewarding assignments, and do you have any anecdotes or stories that you can share?
Well, first of all, thank you. I did. I had a lot of wonderful experiences, and it's the reason when I meet young people who are interested in the State Department, I tell them to join Foreign Service or Civil Service, because the United States of America is going to need great diplomats for years and years to come. And so I hope that young people who will continue to be interested in diplomacy. I'd say that if I look back on my career, I had the great opportunity to be involved in a lot of interesting policies. You know, the expansion of NATO a couple of times, Plan Colombia, the creation of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, all kinds of wonderful and interesting things. But when I look back, the things I think that grip me the most, or I'm most proud of, are the things where I had the opportunity kind of to deal with, to change individual lives, you know, to help somebody, you know, get on an exchange program, to help somebody with a visa problem, very importantly, to help an American citizen abroad who might have run into trouble, you know, not just losing a passport or having a relative die, but, you know, some other terrible problem which we were able to help out. And then I think about, and Michael was kind enough to mention this, after the first Gulf War, you know, Saddam forced 500,000 Kurds up into the mountains between Turkey and Iraq. And thanks to Ambassador Abramowitz and others, and then with our military colleagues, and then international help, we were able to save a huge number of those people. And when I look back on it, the opportunity to kind of change that many lives was just a great honor. So as I say, I loved my time in the Foreign Service. I loved the policy part of it. But I think if I kind of was sitting down to dinner now with a lot of other retired Foreign Service people, our memories would be the strongest of the people we were able to assist, both individually and in larger groups.
Ambassador Grossman, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to personally thank you for your service to the United States, and to thank you for taking the time to do this interview with us. It's been truly a great honor for both of us to speak to you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity today and for the opportunity to contribute to your important volume. And I really appreciate the chance to be with you.